Welcome to Season 2 of The Shift, Stories of Resistance and Resilience, a multi-platform conversation series produced and hosted by me, Mark Charles Rivera, the professional storyteller. I believe that stories have the power to change the world. Through honest conversations and powerful storytelling, we explore how people challenge systems, shift narratives, and transform culture, creating a more inclusive, just, and liberated world in our lives and in our work. Here on this podcast, you'll hear from changemakers, truth tellers, and community builders who are using their voices and their stories to move us forward. So if you believe in the power of storytelling to spark change, you're in the right place. Listen closely, take notes, recognize our shared humanity. This is The Shift. Hey y'all, welcome back to The Shift. New episodes drop this month in June. I'm super excited to keep the conversations going. Season 2 has been phenomenal. If you haven't caught up yet, be sure to check out The Shift wherever you stream your podcast, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, and other places that you may get your podcast. And the conversation continues today with someone that I met. I believe it was your publicist or someone on your comms team reached out to me about your new book. And that's how we got connected. But today's guest is someone that when I first met him, I was deeply moved by all of his work, but more so by the humanness behind the scholar. Often when I meet academics, they tend to be a little too academic-y in the way they communicate. And what I appreciate about you, Dr. Kim, is that you felt like I was talking to one of my friends or colleagues. It was just so easy to talk to you. And so I'm so glad to have you today on The Shift. I'm going to read your official bio before we jump in. Dr. Norman Kim is the inaugural Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the Center for Practice Innovations at Columbia University's Department of Psychiatry, an adjunct faculty member at New York University, and the co-founder of the Institute for Anti-Racism and Equity, a social justice-focused consultancy, and an expert affiliate on LGBTQ rights to the United Nations. He completed his BA at Yale and his PhD in psychology at UCLA, specializing in examining the impacts of racism and discrimination, minority mental health, social determinants of health, and psychiatric complexities. His research and clinical interests span the application of transdiagnostic frameworks for eating disorders and anxiety, evolutionary approaches to shame and psychopathology, autism spectrum disorder, and the developmental course of bipolar disorder. He is a regular national and international speaker, educator, and passion advocate with a particular focus on health equity, systemic racism, and anti-Blackness. He advises health tech startups in the UK and the US, professional organizations, and providers, and was the co-founder of a national eating disorder center. His co-edited book, Anti-Blackness, and the Stories of Authentic Allies, Lived Experiences in the Fight Against Institutionalized Racism, was just released by Oxford University Press. And I'm so excited to be in conversation with my guest today. Welcome, Dr. Kim.
Thank you so much, Marcus. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for those kind words. It's honestly, I never really thought about it before, but I think that's probably the nicest thing you could really say about me. So I appreciate that greatly.
Oh yeah, of course. I also love how you're an active father. Your kids that came in during their pre-interview conversation.
That's right.
I really enjoyed that. As someone who grew up fatherless, it really warms my heart to see other men be fathers. So thank you for showing up in your fullness when we first met.
Sure.
Yeah. So I want to just ask you, I read a lot about your bio and you have a very extensive bio, obviously. But who are you outside of the professional highlights I read in your bio?
Yeah. So, just like you mentioned, I'm a father, probably first and foremost. I'm a husband, and my kids really, in so many ways, inspire what I do. They inspired I have 3 little boys. They're all mixed, and so I think just thinking about not just sort of the fact of them, but also kind of the world that they're coming into really had a tremendous impact on me. And it's a cliche answer, but it's just true that 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 kind of experience just really changes you. Um, I've been a performing musician most of my life, all through
Oh,
since I was a kid, and I was a touring singer songwriter for a while during grad school and then after. So I appreciate that part of my life. It put me into contact with just tremendously talented people who I probably would have never met otherwise, and just having that kind of outlet is just terribly important for me.
yeah.
I'm an immigrant and a person of color. Those have been foundational kind of identities for me. I've always sort of striven. What's the past tense of that word? To
I
be an
know
al.
strived, I would
Is
say.
it strived? Okay, it didn't sound right.
Get
Um,
out.
to be an ally. It's something that also has just been very important to me in my work, and coming at it with the limitations of being cis male and straight, but it's something that's always been a part of what I do. And I think anytime we talk about these things, it's also important to talk about privileges. Obviously, I've had the privilege of having access to tremendous education. I have all the privileges of just being a cis man in our society, and and I think those are things I am very conscious of, and I try to use to the best of my ability to further my work.
Yeah. Wow, I had no idea you were a musician. Somehow that didn't
Yeah,
come up when we were
yeah.
talking. I wish I had known. I would have asked you some questions about your music, your artistic life in the past. But I always love that too, like because as a creative entrepreneur, I have found that I'm hyper creative and do a lot of different creative things like dance, choreography, poetry, journalistic writings,
Mm.
speaking, you know. And I also have a very logical side of my brain that I use pretty frequently. And I think that has been the key to my success is that I have access to pretty fairly good access to both parts of my brain. And for a creative, I have a really good business acumen, which sometimes is not the correlation that people see. That you're
Yeah.
really good at being creative and not so good on the business side, or you're good at the business side, but you're not necessarily a creative. And so I'm happy to find that marriage between the two. But it seems like music and art and singer songwriter life kind of giving you an outlet, and then that kind of leads into your academic life too, right? So that's
Oh,
awesome.
absolutely. I think it's probably the thing that got me through many of the things in my life, and it's just something I find myself turning to. Again, I'm sure you understand being a creative person, just turning to that side of me for just peace and solace and recovery and healing and all of those things that all of us need. So I'm very grateful to have had that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And so we ask every guest this next question, which I feel is really, really important, which is what is your personal concept of resistance and resilience? How do you define those terms for yourself?
Yeah, I love this question. We could spend days, I'm sure, just talking about this one question. So I'm going to try to keep it somewhat brief. But um, so when I think about resistance, the first thing that always comes to mind is the poet Audre Lorde,
Mm,
who wrote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." That's such a as an idea, I think that's among the sort of foundational ideas that are always sort of part of my work and always something I think about. So I think the fact that the words of a Black lesbian poet and scholar from the 70s, when this discourse around the complexities of intersectional identities and broadening our understanding of like discrimination and what civil rights might need to look like, that was really just kind of starting to be a part of our, at least sort of in academia, a part of our discourse in the 70s. And it's something that remains just as true or even possibly more true and more relevant now. And that
yeah,
speaks volumes about how deeply entrenched white supremacy and cis male supremacy are in our country's DNA, in our institutions' DNA, that we haven't really come that much farther in this conversation than when she was first saying those words. Um,
yeah,
you know, so what does that mean to me? I think the master's tools have been and continue to be violence and oppression, right? We've seen ICE crackdowns using the tools of fascism and terror, men hiding behind masks and
Yeah.
targeting the most disempowered, most disenfranchised just because they don't look like they belong here. I think Doge was an extension of that in many ways. There was this coordinated effort to remove a significant path to the middle class for many Black women and men who were federal employees. TSA very recently. I know you fly a lot as well, and
Yeah.
the what we were putting on TSA agents. Again, many of whom are Black women and men.
Yeah.
That all of those things really resulted in this sort of significant, and I think, if I'm not wrong, I think it was the greatest transfer of wealth from BIPOC people to a handful of the wealthiest and most powerful people in this country.
Yeah, I was watching Rachel Maddow recently,
Mm,
actually last night, and I had known some of this was happening because some of his outlining Project 2025, which I feel like I need to go back and really read through some of the key things that are happening because it's really happening in a very concerted effort. But one of the things that she helped me realize is that the Doge and the federal workforce reduction, which targeted primarily the hardest Black women,
mm,
that they also rescinded things like adding certain provisions around equal opportunity employment and
yeah,
removing the anti-segregation clause and contractors agreements and things like that. Right there's been a concerted effort to decentralize Black economic mobility in this country. And we see it most recently with the Voting Rights Act being gutted and
yeah,
essentially considered mute, right, at this point, with the recent Supreme Court ruling out of this case out of Louisiana. And I knew some of this was happening in a very, but I guess because there's so much happening at once, it's kind of hard to keep track of everything, which is obviously part of the point, um,
exactly.
right? But the way she framed it, it was like, oh my goodness, it's going to take years, if not
Yeah,
decades, to recover from this white lash. That's what I call a white lash,
mm, yeah,
to having a Black president for the first time, and we have a two-term Black president, and the amount of progress that happened under his tenure, President Obama. This is why we're experiencing the white lash, right? Because the progress had felt too quick for some folks, and we're not talking enough about it, right? How Black people are being so systemically harmed by the unraveling of the federal government and the things that he's doing. Enough, in my opinion.
absolutely.
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right, and you have sort of that economic violence and oppression. You have literal violence and oppression. Then there's also silencing and erasure. Right? There have been more than 750 pieces of anti-LGBTQ legislation introduced in every state except for Vermont, which is the only state, literally the only state where there have been zero anti-LGBTQ bills that have been introduced in the last several years.
Yeah.
Um, we have, if you look at what's happened in all of the museums in DC, the removal of any mention of slavery and its part in our history. One of my last trips before this current administration, one of my last trips to DC, I happened to be staying at the St. Regis, which is on was on Black Lives Matter Plaza, and so the view from my window was really looking straight down at that and leading to the Capitol buildings, and it was a powerful visual image, which is obviously what it was intended to do. And then I've been back recently, and I didn't see it from that hotel, but just looking at where that used to be, just being painted over. I mean, that's how easy it is, right, to erase something that was so important and representative of something so important. It can literally be erased because it's so institutionalized and it's so just a part. It's the default that stands of we're going to pretend that this thing didn't happen because we don't like to think about it. So all of those things I think are that to me is sort of um, it's the reminder of why any kind of resistance is so important. But it's also a reminder that we can't, on the other side, for those of us who are wanting to engage in that resistance, that we can't and shouldn't count on the tools of oppression to create liberation. Which, we can't also then engage in erasure and silence. We've got to think about sort of what the opposite to that is. And I think this was a part of our original conversation on which we connected, which was, I
Yeah.
think the antidote to all of that is community. The
Yeah.
antidote to oppression and violence and erasure is community and collectivism. And this is the importance of allyship. And so I think that to me is, at least in my context, is what resistance looks like. It's in thinking about activism and all of those things, the point of it all has to be to strengthen us as a community, as a collective, to allow us to engage in greater degrees of empathy and sympathy with one another, to engage in some better ability to just kind of think about how can I use those places where I have privilege or power, for example, to help somebody else who might not have that same privilege or power. And I think everything that we've talked about so far, part of the point of doing those things is to keep us from engaging in that kind of community, to break us up, to
Yeah.
break us apart, to keep us apart, because I think there's at least some sense that when we are able to form that kind of collective sense, that there's power to that, and it's threatening.
The moment that we, as people of color, right, the minority majority of this nation, the moment,
Hmm.
right, even if just Latinos and Black folks did it, it would be a large enough coalition to
Absolutely.
really hinder their ability to keep doing this kind of white supremacy ideology, right? To really try to undermine our democracy and all these things. And I have to be honest with you, because you and I spoke a few months ago. This podcast interview kept getting delayed for first it was my sickness because I was traveling so a lot. Then you had a conflict, and then
Mm.
there was another conflict. I think this is like our third attempt or fourth attempt to schedule this. And then, of course, today we scheduled it on Memorial Day. And I'm like, I'm so sorry. I don't really pay attention to holidays unless they're like the major ones. And you were nice enough to do it on Memorial Day. So thank you.
Sure.
But there's this thing, it's getting harder for me to not want to go to the gutter with these folks.
Hmm.
Like Michelle Obama said, when they go high, when they go low, we go high. And it's because it's they're testing my patience, right? There's
Yeah.
to give a slush fund to this man, to then give it to insurrectionists, people who were convicted, right? These are not people who were found, innocent through the criminal justice system, right? And the hypocrisy, the level of hypocrisy, the level of dissonance that these people are showing, right? It is astonishing to me. And I really thought the high spike in gas costs and food and stuff a year into this presidency would have awakened some people. And
Hmm.
something about him, I mean, he'll go down, I think, in the history books as one of the most, not just corrupt, but one of the most influential kind of political figures in that he was able to do what Hitler did, right? Convince a
Yeah.
certain population of that country that these people were the enemy, and
Yeah.
then convince these people to follow his ideology. So much so that we put up, you know, in this case, detention camps, not necessarily concentration camps, right? But this idea, the parallelism between him and Hitler is it's uncanny. But it's like so much of these people are not moved by actual facts. They're
Yeah.
not moved by the reality. And that's not, I don't want to paint a broad stroke, right? Like there are some people who voted for him for economic purposes who are now regretting that decision because the economy is doing worse,
Sure.
right? But it's like, it's getting harder for me to be honest. I'm being honest with you, Dr. Kim. It's getting harder for me not wanting to like use the master's tools against these fools
Yeah.
because, and I don't believe in shame and blame either, like as a tactic, but it's just like,
Mm.
have you no shame? Have at what point is like
Mm.
when do you realize this is just cruel and unnecessary?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's been hard. It's been hard for me. Like I had a debate with a friend, associate from college, who was like trying to act one way and publicly in this public discourse, and then when I kept coming at her with facts and not just feelings, she then got into her feelings and sent me a private message that was very derogatory. I'm just, oh, this is how you really feel. So I screenshotted that private message and put it back in that public thread so people could really see the context in which she was speaking to me and approaching me, right? And I normally don't do that. I normally don't kind of like publicly shame or try to out anyone or, but it was just so contrary to what she was saying publicly that I was like, oh, you can't handle the facts.
Yeah.
Right? And so as much as you accuse me of relying on feelings, you're actually the one relying on feelings.
Right.
Yeah. It's a trippy thing. How are you staying patient in this process? Because I know you have to deal with being in academia and having students of all different backgrounds and beliefs. How are you managing that?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know that I am necessarily. I think it's so hard to not, it's so hard not to feel just defeated day after day. The minute I think that there's something that is like the worst thing that I've heard, the next day there's something even worse, right? So I know that it's affected my work. I certainly know that it's affected sort of how I move through the world and my own sense of safety and um, and just my own sense of sort of being able to hold hope in doing this work that I do. Um, and so I don't know that I have a good answer for how do you stay sort of fighting through all of that, except for again this I feel like this sounds like a I don't know, a canned, not a canned answer, but just something because we're sitting here talking. But I I I do feel like the more I talk with people like you, the more I talk with other people who are also just as angry and who are also just as much wanting to just create something different and new and better. Those conversations are what keep me going and energize me because I need to feel, I need the reminder that there are also other people. And I think I think when two people, when any group of people, when we share our stories with one another, when you share sort of what you're going through and what you felt like you had to do with somebody to keep them in check and to just sort of stand up for yourself, and when I hear those stories, that's what helps me at least feel like, okay, we're going through something together.
Yeah.
And in
Yeah.
going through something together, that's I think what our strength is. And I mean, this sort of relates to the second part of the question, right? This is, I think, what resilience looks like. Resiliency is, we could name 1,000 things that have happened that have affected us directly or indirectly, and we're still here, right?
Yeah.
We're still standing. Our communities are still standing. Our ancestors still did what they were able to do, such that you and I could be here, and
And
hopefully
not
that
just be here, right?
continues.
Not just be here, but thrive.
But thrive, absolutely. But
Yeah,
thrive,
right. Like we
absolutely.
didn't really survive for us just to survive to exist.
That's right.
They survived so we could thrive. And I think
Exactly.
that and I think you're right. I mean, that's the whole premise of my company. That's the whole mission, right? To embrace the power of stories to create a more inclusive world. Because I believe that it is really hard to hate someone when you see yourself reflected in their story,
Yeah,
right? And so you and
absolutely.
I on the surface can look very different, right?
Mhm.
Bald, gray hair, right? Asian, Latino, right?
Right.
Queer, straight, married, single, kids, no kids, right?
Mhm.
Highly educated, not as educated, right? And so there's all these things that you think that we have, but then there's other things that we have in common, right? There's this
Yeah.
lust, this creativity, this desire to help others, to harness the power of stories. We're both speakers, right? We both come from, less than ideal circumstances in terms of, I'm sure, economically, and
Mhm.
you being an immigrant in this country, and me being the first generation to graduate high school and go to college, and all these things, right? And how all those things were the building blocks to who we became,
Yeah,
right? And then you recognize, well, wow, we could be so different, but there are things that connect us.
that's
And when you
absolutely
realize
right.
things that connect us, it's hard. And that's why I have found myself engaging more and more with my more conservative right population in my orbit, or either associates or people I meet in organizations that I work at or work with or places I speak at, because I've had some of those people come to me afterwards and say, I have a different perspective now because of you. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for helping me realize something about myself that I was doing, because I don't use shame and blame when I'm facilitating or speaking,
Mhm.
because that causes people defense mechanism to go up, and then all of listening shuts down.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's a place for all of us in this movement towards liberation. And I know that my place isn't to burn it all down to the ground, you know, fight fire with fire, right? Like
Mhm.
as much as the rage bubbles in me, I know that if I humanize those who try to dehumanize me,
Yeah.
it keeps my humanity in place. It keeps my moral compass where it needs to be, right?
Right.
And there are people out there who don't agree with that tactic, and that's fine, right? Like we all have a role to play in this collective liberation. But I want to switch gears a little bit because I want to ask you this next question. And
Mhm.
this had came up when you and I were talking about in our pre-interview around the role that we play as men of color in combating um, anti-blackness in our communities, right?
Mhm.
I was just speaking about this with my interviewer in the interview I had prior to you today around, I'm kind of going out of sequence, but I feel like this is a good segue around how we as men of color um, combat, anti-blackness, which is such a universal conditioning for many of us and our other minority groups, and that we all have to resist that and unlearn that conditioning. What advice do you have for other people of color who want to be authentic allies and commit to ending anti-blackness?
Yeah, this is such a crucial question, right? So, obviously, I'm an Asian American um, uh, person who in my work centers blackness. The book that you talked about is all about anti-blackness and from different perspectives, but it still centers anti-blackness. And I'm in a position where, at just being an Asian person who's doing this work, I'm in a position where I'm working, I think, both as an insider and as an outsider in some ways as well. So the example that comes to mind for me is the model minority myth, right? So the model minority myth is not about like uplifting Asian people. It's not about look how amazing those Asian people are. It's much more explicitly about see black and brown folks. The Asians are doing okay. Why can't you be like that?
Right,
Right? It
right,
doesn't uplift us. It's just another manifestation of white supremacy and anti-blackness, and so to, to me, I think that understanding, the all just like we were talking about before, all of these attempts to pit us against one another in all sorts of ways.
yeah,
I think the more that we can understand, again, especially maybe this is somewhat specific to our experience in here in the U.S., but um, I I certainly understand and see and look at my own experiences of anti-Asian hate, like during COVID, for example, and
uh-huh,
discrimination as being very much directly rooted in anti-blackness. The
mhm,
negative stereotypes and sense of threat that's always been a part of white supremacy just kind of get transferred onto or adapted to different groups in different ways. But it's
yeah,
all rooted in chattel slavery, what that meant for this country, the fact that we wouldn't exist as a country were it not for chattel slavery, the fact that Europe wouldn't have been the economic power that it was were it
yeah,
not for the enslavement of Black people. And everything that sort of comes from that is something that is, I think, terribly important for us to understand. So it starts with that looking inwards. We have to look at our own biases, our own blind spots. Obviously, being a person of color doesn't inoculate me from anti-black bias. Far from it. We internalize white supremacy culture just as much, if not
yeah,
more. Right. So we have to start by doing our own internal work to dismantle it within ourselves, to
yeah.
recognize it when it
That's a
shows up.
deconditioning.
And
That's a
yeah,
conditioning I was talking about, right? Because
yeah.
as someone who grew up in a very bicultural household, as someone who grew up in a very black and brown neighborhood, I had to realize that there were some internalized anti-blackness that I had gotten just by osmosis, just by being around my relatives, who they themselves were replicating this white supremacy culture around being anti-black, right?
Mhm.
So some of them had dark skin, which looking back at
Yeah.
it now, like the irony of that, right?
Mhm.
I'm not black, I'm Puerto Rican, or I'm not black, I'm Dominican, right? And this idea of no, you're black, and you happen to be of Dominican descent or
Right.
Puerto Rican descent, right? But there is a diaspora of blackness, right? The African diaspora, and so I think, and I want to get a little bit for you to dig in a little bit more on how, because there are plenty of white people that we know who do anti-racist, anti-black, and to stop anti-blackness and anti-racism work, and sometimes they get a lot of flack for the amount of space they take up.
Mhm.
And I wonder, how have you navigated that in your career as an Asian American, as an
Yeah.
Asian cis het man?
Yeah. Right. Um, I I I think that's again such a crucial part of doing this work, right? If you're coming at it, like I started off saying, if you're kind of coming at it a little bit from the outside, recognizing everything that you just talked about, the as you were talking, I was thinking about like skin lightening products that are sort of, Korea cosmetics industry is
Yeah,
huge, right? And skin lightening is a big part of that. The most common plastic surgery in all of Asia is the eye surgery that makes your eyes look less like Asian eyes, and
yeah,
there's a very clear message in all that. So, how do you keep from decentering yourself? I th- I think there's a difference when you're doing this work with an understanding of I'm using my privilege and my power.
mm,
Um, so, the when I do trainings, the one example I give is for anybody who might consider themselves an ally. When you see or hear a microaggression in, let's say, a work setting, which is a very common thing to happen,
yeah,
that so one scenario is the person who is being microaggressed against, presumably, if they're a black or brown person or queer or trans person, if they're experiencing the microaggression, I think most people kind of wait for that person to sort of say something. And
mm,
then maybe we feel like, okay, now I can sort of support you. And that's not really, I think that's obviously good. It's better than not doing that. But I don't think that's necessarily allyship. I think allyship is that you don't count on that person who was just experienced the microaggression to be the one to say something, that you, especially if you're in a position of power in other ways in that
yeah,
situation, you use that power to be the one to point it out, to call it out, to stand up, to invite the uncomfortableness, right, that we all feel in those social situations, especially if it's coworkers. To
yeah,
call out a coworker for a misogynistic comment or a racist comment or a homophobic comment, to do that, understanding that there's going to be some sort of social price to pay. That's allyship to me. That's how we use our our power and privilege without actually without centering me or my experience.
yeah.
And it, I think there's I think that's kind of the way to approach this work in whatever ways we might think about approaching it. And again, it has to start from having done that work so that you recognize it when it comes. It's not changing your changing your social media badge or profile or
Yeah,
whatever during Pride Month. Again, important. I think it's not nothing, but
I think
that's
it's nothing when
performative.
I think it's nothing when you just do it during
Yeah,
Pride Month, but
yeah,
nothing that you do internally or externally, policy wise,
right.
implementation wise, if you're providing a service to people or consumer goods, right? If you do
Yeah,
nothing to support or amplify or use your positionality to support LGBTQ plus people beyond just changing your logo, then that's not at all helpful or necessary. I think it's just performative.
yeah,
And I would have more respect for brands if they just stopped doing it and just said, we're going to stop all the performative action and just show you who we are,
yeah,
right? Because then that allows us to decide where we put our dollars to, right?
right.
And I think for me, one of the things that has become really critically important for me, especially as someone who has predominantly dated Black men of both trans and cisgender experiences, is recognizing when I'm speaking to defend them right? And then, or speaking like when I'm doing it to in a way that doesn't center my rage,
Mm,
but really center their humanity. And I think
yeah.
sometimes when, you know, 'cause I've had people say things in front of my partners, especially my trans partner, that has pissed me off so much that I go off. But it's my rage that I'm centering.
Mm,
It's, hey, this is wrong, and the fact that you did this to him is not okay, right?
right.
And so also recognizing the intent and how that happens really matters. Like recently, I had a client. She's a new executive director of this organization that I'm working with, and me and her marketing consultant had very different opinions on this video message that she was putting out. And this marketing person happened to be a white woman, and this new executive director is a biracial woman of color. And I had said to my client, I said, listen, this is not the time to be informal. And I had to explain to the white woman consultant,
Mm,
I had to tell her, women of color do not have the benefit of being informal when they're doing
mm,
this kind of real message for the first time externally to audiences.
yeah.
And in that same conversation, the white woman said to me, yeah, well, I appreciate you bringing that to my attention, blah, 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 because it did come off a little mansplaining. And I was like,
Jeez.
I've never been accused of mansplaining. I'm sure I've done it. I'm a man
Mm,
nonetheless, a pretty man, but a man nonetheless. And so I had to go back to my client for a second. I was like, did that come off as mansplaining to you? Because that's not how I'm very protective of this client because I know her personally. I really care about her. I think
mm,
she's the right person for the right moment in this organization's history. But I know a lot of the context of the past and maybe something that this other consultant doesn't know.
right.
But the fact that my feedback to them and my pushback to them came off as mansplaining, I thought was really, really interesting. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll be more mindful how I present my information because I can be very direct and very like don't
Mm,
or no fluff. And I can see how that might come off as like someone just being very direct and be as like my masculine energy can come out that way. But I thought it was really interesting that rather than taking my feedback, her initial thought was to say, well, let me give you some feedback on how that came off as mansplaining. And I don't think there
yeah.
was any real interrogation on you as a white woman were giving a woman of color
Mm,
advice around being more informal. And, women of color don't have the benefit of being informal in certain work settings, in certain contexts,
yeah.
right? And eventually the client did find a good happy medium that kind of took her feedback and my feedback and it worked out okay. But that was such an example of like how me trying to be an ally to this woman of color and being very protective of her
Mm,
would be perceived as a mansplaining person, right? And I had to really
yeah.
check, like, did this come out as mansplaining to you? Like, how can I work on my delivery for you? Because I care about what you feel and think, right? Because you're my client. The other person is not my client. They're a consultant that we work with, but you're my client, right? And having that conversation with her to make sure that I'm being mindful of how I'm showing up in space, right? And also
Yeah.
understanding how my need to be protective of her can come off as very patriarchal, right? And how that can
Mm,
be sexist in some standards,
mm,
right? And so it's constantly like this
yeah.
interrogation of self, right? As you're trying to stand up and do the right thing. And I think that's the key for people who want to be authentic allies is to never stop the self interrogation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, like, this is like, I, this the clip of you going through all of that is
Yeah.
what should be shown in any training around like how we should be thinking about these things for ourselves. It's the minute it happens to be thinking about like to take the feedback, even though like as you said, there's the context of the feedback was whatever, a little, maybe a little bit sus, but to take that feedback and in the moment think about like, did I mansplain in this
Yeah.
situation? I know what my intention is, but I also understand that the impact matters more than my intention. But like to
Yeah.
really go through that process for yourself, that's exactly what we ask people to do. And there was such a lovely example of really just how to do it in a intentional and just really sort of honest and vulnerable way with yourself. And I think that's just so terribly difficult to do if you haven't already done some work. Right? Clearly,
Yeah,
that's coming from whatever work you've done to get to this point in your life,
therapy,
and
lots of therapy, lots of
yeah,
therapy.
yeah, right. That's what I mean.
Lots of therapy. Well,
Yeah,
there's a level. I mean, I'm also a coach, right? So I think there's a level of empathy
sure.
and self and introspection that comes natural to me.
Mm,
But it's really about separating my ego from the end result, right? Because the
right.
end result wasn't to convince her to do it my way or the highway. It was, I want to make sure that you get as much context as possible. And then I want her, because I
Mm,
wasn't saying we were going a lot. It was a lot of writing back and forth,
yeah,
and so that's always cool, right? Because you don't want to write down in writing. You as a white woman don't understand
right.
that, right? So there's a lot of like. So I was having this
Yeah.
conversation with my client first, giving her some context where I was coming from, and then I have to go back to the other consultant and say, "This is where I was coming from. This is why."
Mm, yeah.
Right? And I think that introspection is key, right? To recognize, and even now, right, as a well-meaning, empathetic, kind, generous person, I make mistakes because we're human. We all make mistakes, right?
Exactly.
Like we, none of us are absolved from making mistakes. But I think the difference between those who maybe don't have the purest of intentions or those who know they're doing harm but continue to do harm is
Mm,
that we take a moment to self-reflect,
mm,
right? And
yeah.
at our core, I don't think every voter who voted for Trump is a racist, homophobic, xenophobic person, but every racist, xenophobic, homophobic person or transphobic person voted for Trump, right? And that this
Yeah.
whole sum of all parts, right? You can't just loop
Mm,
everyone in, right? Because then what we're doing is using the master's tool. We're dehumanizing
yeah.
them to the lowest barometer of of generous human decency by saying that they prioritize economic advantage over human life.
Mm,
Is that wrong? In my opinion, yes. It's wrong that you put economics above people.
yeah.
And then the economy still didn't get better. Like that's the ironic part, right? It's like I
Right.
felt like texting that one person on my Facebook, and I felt like telling them so bad. Oh, how's that grocery bill looking for you? Because
Right.
while me and this other person were talking about it privately, she said, I voted for Trump not because I agree with all his social beliefs, but because of the economy, right? And it goes back to that old adage, it's the economy stupid, right? Like the economy is what drives people, right? When they feel it in their pocketbook.
Yeah.
But I said, but where are we now, right? And I think that's where, of all the things that white supremacy culture and ideology and slavery and all these things voided us of, is this communal way of living. As
Mm,
people of color, we know innately, as indigenous, as Latinos, as Asian, as Black folks, we
mm,
know that we're very communal by nature, right? Which is why
yeah.
the whole American dream is so built on individualism. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? But we were never meant to live this way, right? Our ancestors, the indigenous people of these lands, they have
Mm,
taught us that individualism was not the key to a great life,
yeah.
but rather it was in the community, in the communal way of living that we found true joy, happiness, connection, laughter, dance, right?
Yeah.
And we need to get back to that.
Oh, 100%. And if we when we think about any healing practice of almost any, especially indigenous cultures, but any sort of any non-Western European kind of culture, healing didn't happen in a closed office with one person, and that's not what healing looked like. Healing was in the community. Healing was your family, your community, literally around you while you were going through whatever you were going through, because they're a part of your life, and they're a
Yeah.
part of your therefore they're a part of your healing process. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that we've made in sort of Western medicine, is we've so sterilized ourselves from that sense of community and that sense of connection. We know that from certainly from mental health standpoint, but I think also applicable to our physical health issues, that the more somebody feels a sense of connection to their community, the better they end up being. They have supports. They have all sorts. There are all sorts of benefits from that kind of standpoint. But like, because we think of it as like whatever ideas people have about it as whatever, either primitive or just it doesn't matter. I think the farther we get away from that, the more we're going to see the kind of suffering that we see, the limitations of just for just sitting across from one person in this little box trying to solve, help them figure out what's going wrong with them when we and they are kind of disconnected from the rest of their life.
Yeah.
We don't know where they live. We don't know how they grew up. We don't know the kind of community they grew up in. We rarely know much about their particular culture and their belief systems and the traumas of their family and the all of that stuff is just terribly. But that is all that lives in us, and that's
Yeah.
a part of how we exist in the world. And we just care about this like one thing that we can see in front of us. And so no wonder we're so bad at, especially sort of chronic health problems, chronic mental health issues.
Mhm.
We're really bad in our Western sort of healthcare system of really doing much about those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I think it's this. I think it's because we are just we've removed ourselves from thinking about our connection to other people. That
Yeah.
what I do affects everyone else around me,
Yeah.
and beyond that.
Yeah, and I think there has to be. I mean, I think so many people have very low empathy skills, and I think that so many people have very little compassion because they just never were taught how to do those things, how
Yeah.
to be. We talk about being, sharing is kind, and be kind to your friend at school and all
Mhm.
these things, but eventually that kind of stops happening. Those conversations stop,
Yeah.
and people forget what it means to be your neighbor, what it means to be a good neighbor, what it means to love thy neighbor, if you want to give a religious
Mhm.
context, and I think for me, and I know we're almost out of time, but I just want to, I feel like I can talk to you forever. The
Yeah.
conversation is so good. Um, but I want to ask you this last question, and I'm doing a hard pivot because we're running low on time, and I want to honor your time, especially on a day off. What do you hope to shift in society through your work?
Yeah. I I I think about my sphere of influence and sort of what I can do. It's actually very related to what we were just talking about. Like what I was thinking about as you were talking was the irony of this like sort of pull yourself up by the bootstraps is that that's not in any way reflective of the reality of the country or of people,
Mhm.
right? There's this narrative about who we are as a country that's largely mythology, that's demonstrably untrue, but we choose to ignore that because we need to perpetuate this other story of who we wish we were as a country. The only way to do that is to ignore the unpleasant truth of how we got here. And in my field, there's a similar thing. The idea about us as professionals, about us as healers, whatever. There's a similar myth and aspirational quality to that. It's not accurate. So, on the one hand, most of the fields in psychology, psychiatry, social work, most of us have at least acknowledged our roles in perpetuating white supremacy,
Yeah,
in perpetuating harm on Black and Brown communities in particular, on women, on LGBTQ communities. And that's an important start. And all of our professions are at least working to try to dismantle that, as best as we can. And then
yeah,
as individuals, we have those same narratives about who we wish we were or who we think we are. That's often also rooted in myth and aspiration as opposed to who we actually are. And in all of those cases, it's absolutely necessary that we rewrite those stories to reflect what's actually true. I can't
mm,
heal if I don't recognize who I actually am. Our institutions will never change or heal if they don't recognize who they actually are and what they're actually doing. And certainly our country is never going to heal if we don't actually realize the truth of how we got to where we are. And so what we need to do to recognize and honor that truth. So
yeah,
I in certainly as an individual, I hope as a teacher, as in whatever ways I can in the work that I do, I try to perpetuate this and sort of communicate the importance of this idea that I mean that's what therapy is, right? Therapy is you recognize learn to see who you are in the world. For some people, that means seeing yourself as better than you think you are, because we all have our struggles with self-worth and self-doubt. Sometimes it's about recognizing that you're actually not as bad as you think you are. But for other people, it's recognizing that the idea about who they think they are is kind of this mythology, and that they just need to be more in touch with who they actually are in the world. Otherwise, they can't move forward. So I think in whatever ways I can, professionally in my field as an advocate, I try to communicate the importance of this, of changing that story, which also I think has the implication that you can change the story, right? We
Yeah.
can all rewrite our story again, not as fiction, but rewrite it by doing things differently, by understanding ourselves better, and by looking at the world differently.
Yeah, I'm currently working on book number 2, so this is book number 1. By the way, you're gonna get a signed copy sent to you for being a
I would
guest. So
love one. Yeah.
thank you. It's a compilation of poetry and essays, but I'm working on book number 2, which is called Revisions. I'm actually going away in July for a writer's retreat. I'm going to a cabin in North Georgia by myself and kind of isolating myself in the woods to get this manuscript done. But there was something about when you said rewrite, not necessarily to change what was, but to imagine a revised version of my life story. How do I want to write the next manuscript, right? How do I want to? Because a lot of what I wrote in that book was so aspirational. And I was I wrote that book. The pieces in that book are from age 14 to 26. I just turned 35 this month, right? And so now I'm writing it from my 30s perspective, looking back at book number 1, like, oh, that was very aspirational of you. Let's give people some hard truths about what that looks like in
Yeah.
practice. And so also knowing that the story you have written isn't going to be the story you write tomorrow, and that the things we've done in the past don't necessarily have to be the things we continue to do. And I think that I have, despite my anger sometimes at the world that we're in right now, especially this country, that there's the optimism doesn't come easy to me. Actually, I'm quite not the optimist. People have this perception of me that I am, but I work really hard to be joyful and optimistic. It's not my natural disposition. My natural disposition is melancholy. It's sadness. It's we're doomed. I work really hard to be optimistic, but there is still a lingering hope. And I felt this when President Obama said those words right after Trump won. The idea that the sun will rise tomorrow. Tomorrow will be a new day. I'm paraphrasing that quote, but it's the idea that, our today won't be our tomorrow. And it definitely won't be our forever if we're willing to do the work to change it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Kim. Thank you for
Thank
doing
you.
the work. Thank you for we couldn't even talk much about academia because I know I want to talk more about that. That was one of the questions, and we just kept going and going. I just want to, we ran out of time, but I just want to thank you for the work you're doing in academia, especially right now. As someone who used to work in higher ed, I know it's not an easy field to be in at any given time, but especially right now, especially given your work in DEI and things that you're doing. So thank you for causing good trouble and for remaining an active ally in this movement, and for all that you do for our communities.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I
Yeah.
really appreciate this conversation.
Likewise, me too, and thank you again for doing it on your day off. I know that can be a struggle.
Fine.
So, y'all be sure to connect with Dr. Kim. I'm going to put all his social media links, his book links, all of that in the show notes. But please do share this podcast with the folks in your life, especially people who want to be authentic allies in combating anti-Blackness and really, standing side by side our Black brothers and sisters and siblings in this movement, because what this moment is calling for is for collective liberation and collective action.
Absolutely.
And we owe a great deal to Black people in this world and in this country in particular. And so make sure that you're standing up for them in a way that feels authentic and genuine, that doesn't censor your ego, but censors their humanity. Till next time, be well.